projector. All right, so tonight's plan is going to be, I'm going to lecture on Chapter 5 and show you the audio PowerPoint on Chapter 5. Okay, and then I'll be around to help people with Chapter 4 homework if you need help with that. The exam, in my opinion, went well. Okay, I believe the last time I checked it, the average was like a 90%. Okay, so great job. If I left some comments on your exam, I would say take those comments and take heed for the next exam, exam 2, which you're probably going to have in I would say 2 weeks. Okay. Tonight I'm gonna cover Chapter 5. The next week I'm going to cover 7 and 8, and then plan to have Chapter 2. To have the second exam before Thanksgiving. I'm going to run it just like I ran the first exam. Okay, that worked for me, and it seemed like it really worked well for you all too. Okay, so from what I remember from grading, a lot of people, and it's important for me to speak on this so you know how I will be grading from here on out. Like when it came to Task 9, when it asked you all for the conditional format, some people went about it a different way. Okay, but you still got the end result that I was looking for. So in a task like that, if you came up with a different solution than what the department was looking for, I gave you full credit. But on certain questions, okay, some people, where there was one question where it required you to use VLOOKUP, some people use if statements. Okay, because you use an if statement, and I know that you put some time into it, when you came up with that, I gave you like half credit. But if you were like way off base, or if you didn't put any work into the question, I would have to either deduct all the points or give you very little points back. Okay, I tried to be as fair as I could. There was like one question where some people, your payments came back as negative. It showed red and it was negative, so that meant you meant the negative symbol in front of the PMT or in front of the present value argument. For that, I only deducted like 3 points because you can get 10 for that type of question. I tried to be as fair as I could. Like I said, overall, the average was like a 90. And I believe in giving you multiple chances with your homeworks and your sims and your quizzes, but not even the quizzes, really. I can't give you multiple chances with the exams and with the quiz, okay? So just know, for exam 2, I'm going to administer it the same way I did, okay? But just know what I'm looking for, all right? Like I said, there's so many different ways you can come to an answer in Excel, but certain things do require you to use a specific formula. And when you're reading these instructions, it's important for you to really pay attention to every single word. That's why a lot of you didn't show up last week, and that's fine. But that's why I mentioned to the people who showed up here that, I don't have a problem with you using Google. I don't have a problem with you using Excel help, okay? Because when you're reading those questions, that's what you should be picking up on. Okay, what do they mean by structured reference? You should be going into Excel help, searching structured reference, Googling what is the structured reference, and then refreshing your memory. And then that's what you should be attempting. All right? That's just like a for instance. Okay? So without further ado, does anyone have any questions about anything I said, or do you need me to repeat anything? Or all right, we're all on the same page. Again, tonight we're going to do Chapter 5. Next week we'll do 7 and 8. Then the following week, look for Exam 2, which should be Chapters 5, 7, and 8. All right? Oh, yeah, another thing I need to mention is that this was the first time I gave this exam the way the department wanted me to. And the biggest difference I saw was that my prior classes, they actually got more work than you guys got for this exam, okay? You guys got 9 tasks, and they covered the first 4 chapters. I was giving my classes, like you guys get for your homework, they were getting each chapter exam, like that, okay? So I'm mentioning that because, you know, you guys should consider that. It's like a more comprehensive type of exam that the department is using. And like I said, it is less work than I was given before. All right? So that's another reason why I was like, you know, I don't feel like I need to curve it. You know, I have to accept the grades as is, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so chapter 5. We're moving on to subtotals, pivot tables, and pivot charts. All right. The objectives of this chapter are subtotal data, grouping and ungrouping data, creating a pivot table, modifying a pivot table, and filtering and slicing a pivot table. We're going to talk about creating a calculated field. Excuse me. Changing the design of the pivot table, creating a data model, and creating a pivot chart. Skills include sorting multiple fields, the subtotal data feature, adding a second subtotal, and collapsing and expanding subtotals. All right. Here on the screen, let me see here. We have an example of the subtotal command inserted by Excel. And the subtotal command is a row that includes one or more aggregate functions, such as sum or average. Okay, the subtotal command is very similar to the total row. All right, the big difference between the two is that you use subtotals on a range of data, not a table. Okay, when I talked about chapter 4, we talked about large data sets that you could create in tables. You would use subtotal and just a range. Basically, a range is just like a spreadsheet. A range just like that. All right. In the subtotal window, you can select the different statistical function like sum, average, like the same type of statistical functions that you would see in the total row. And here you can select different columns, okay? Units sold, for example. So to add subtotals to a data set, you click on the subtotal. You click the subtotal button, which is up here, and it's on the data tab. And it's inside the outline group. All right. So anytime you read this stuff in Excel, they'll say things about like tabs. These are all tabs, and they'll say something about the group. The group name is usually at the bottom here on this bar. Okay. And that stuff is good to know because sometimes they're throwing so many terms at you. Okay, so again, to add subtotals to a data set, you click on the subtotal button and the outline group on the data tab. Okay. All right, now you can sort and you can sum different rows when you subtotal data. All right. You can also add a second level of subtotals to a data set. Adding a second level maintains the primary subtotals and adds another level of subtotals for subcategories. All right, so you can see it all collapsing right here. When you press subtotals, you'll get this ability to collapse and expand your spreadsheet. Okay. Here in the example, and it shows the social problems category, and then the individual areas: alcohol/drugs, conflict approach, general, and violence. All those things could be subtotal within this data set. Okay, so the idea behind this chapter, again, just like chapter 4, you're given a large spreadsheet of data and you need to make quick sense of it. Okay, so subtotal is one of the features in Excel that helps you manipulate and navigate through a large spreadsheet. All right, here, and this slide shows some example of the sum rows totaled, okay, or added. Okay, the subtotal command creates a hierarchical structure of data that can be grouped into related data to summarize. When a data set has been grouped into an outline, you can collapse the outline data to show only main rows, such as subtotals, or expand the outline data to show all the details. All right. So that's the main point of subtotaling. Subtotaling. Okay. Taking a large spreadsheet, and you can create quick statistical functions, all right, or run quick statistical functions. All right, now we're going to move on to objective 2, which is grouping and ungrouping data. Okay. To create an outline by columns, you can click on the Data tab, and then click on the group arrow in the outline group, and then select Auto Outline. All right. If you need more control when creating your outline, you can create a group, which you see right here. The group option, group and ungroup. All right. This joins rows or columns of related data together into a single entity, so the group can be collapsed or expanded for data analysis. And if you need to remove a group, you would select the group, column, or row, and then click Ungroup. All right. Now we're going to move on to creating a pivot table. Skills include creating a recommended pivot table, creating a blank pivot table, and renaming a pivot table. All right, so data mining. The process of data mining is it analyzes large volumes of data, like a big spreadsheet. All right, a pivot table is an interactive table that uses calculations to consolidate and summarize data. All right, it enables you to analyze data in a data set, and it can be easily and quickly be rearranged to analyze data from different viewpoints. We'll touch more into that. Here's an example of a pivot table. All right, a pivot table can be created from the quick analysis gallery or from the recommended pivot tables command in the tables group on the insert tab. Okay, so you see insert right here in Excel. All right, and while these slides are going on, it's good for you to browse around in Excel just so you can see the different tabs and the groups, you know. So in the insert tab is where you will find to insert a pivot table. All right. You can also create a pivot table using the quick analysis. You can right-click on a data set and then select quick analysis from the shortcut menu. Right-click on a data set, meaning right-click on a large piece of data. And then you can right-click, and then you can create a pivot table right from there. Here's a sample of a pivot table. Here's the recommended pivot tables option up here on the insert tab. And here shows some different thumbnails of pivot tables that Excel will create for you by default. They'll give you a little preview. So to create a pivot table from the recommended pivot tables dialog box, you'll click inside of a data set, then you click the insert tab, and then you can click on recommended pivot tables again in the tables group. Once that dialog box is displayed, you can point to a thumbnail here in the gallery on the left side for a preview, and then you can select it, and then your pivot table will be created on your spreadsheet. The whole idea of a pivot table is to take certain data out of a spreadsheet, okay, and just do analysis on certain things you need to know. All right, you can basically think of it as taking little pieces out of a full table, like 2 columns or 3 columns out of a table, and just seeing different analysis from those 3 columns, okay? So here we have an example of a pivot table on a new worksheet, okay? On a new sheet, a pivot table and the pivot table fields list task pane is displayed right here. So once you create a pivot table, Excel will enable the pivot table tools right above here. And then you should see the pivot table fields here. They should work the same way on Macs, okay? Pivot tables are a pretty important feature with Excel. All right? And it's important that you're seeing this pivot table fields, because this is how you're mainly going to be working with your pivot table. Now you can see down here in the lower right on the pivot table fields task pane, we have filters, columns, rows, and values. All right, now here in the example, the discipline field has been clicked on, and then you drag it down to rows. You see it says discipline, and it's selected down here. So that was dragged down here to the rows, and then you'll see it right here. So on the rows, it's displaying the disciplines. All right. And then right here in the values, it says sum of units, and right here, sum of units sold wholesale. All right. So again, you would take a field from the pivot table fields task pane and drag it down here to manipulate your pivot table. All right. If you don't want to use the recommended pivot tables, you can create a blank pivot table. All right. So you create a blank pivot table, again on the Insert tab in the Tables group. Click Pivot Table to open the Create Pivot Table dialog box. Then you select the data you want to analyze, okay? And it could be a table or a range within an open workbook or a connection to an external data sheet, okay? So with pivot tables will work in a table or a range, okay? Remember, subtotals will only work on a range, all right? And then you select where you want to place the pivot table. You can put it on a new worksheet, or you can put it on an existing worksheet. All right, now we're going to move on to modifying a pivot table. Adding rows to a pivot table, adding columns to a pivot table, removing fields, rearranging fields in a pivot table, changing the value field settings, and refreshing a pivot table. All right, once you have a pivot table created, you may need to make certain changes to it. All right, so you can add a field as a row, and if you would want to do that, you would click on the Fields checkbox to select it and to choose Fields to add to Report section. That's right up here. Okay, then you drag the field from the Choose field to Add to Report section, and then you drop into the rows. And then you can right click on the field name and then say choose fields to add to report. I'm sorry, that's actually one of 3 ways you can add a field to that section. You can either choose it from the checkbox, you can drag it, or you can right click on the field name and say add it to the report section. All right. So here in the example, I have pivot table fields, and then under rows here, there's discipline and area in rows. And you can see here in the example, discipline, and then the areas of this discipline are showed beneath it. Then it's showing the same units, or the sum of units sold wholesale, and the values. Okay. Again, the pivot table fields task pane is basically where you're going to be living to manipulate your pivot table. Adding rows, adding values, adding columns, it all works the same way. Okay, you select choose fields to add to the report from here, and then you can click, or you can right click on here and say add it to here, or you can just drag them. Okay, so here in the example, count of book titles is here under values. All right, sum of units sold is right here, and the sum of sales displays right here. Okay, to subdivide data into columns. So right here it just says one column from each copyright year plus grand total, plus there's also a grand total column. To subdivide data into columns, drag a field from the choose fields to add to report section and drop it in the column section. You see this here? And then is in the example, it breaks it down by year because copyright is in the column section. Okay. Also, the discipline is showing as rows in this example here, and again, the values. All right. You can also remove fields from your pivot table. To remove a field from a pivot table, you can either deselect it. You can click on the checkbox next to the field name to deselect it. You can click on the field name and then select remove. You can also drag it from that area. You can drag it outside the pivot table fields list. Okay, you don't drag it back to the fields list, you just drag it outside of the field list. Headphones. We're going to talk about slicers soon. All right, I can't rush this pivot table stuff because, you know, it's not the most exciting material, but a lot of people can get hung up on that stuff. All right, so moving on to modifying a pivot table. Excel uses the sum function as a default summary statistic for numerical fields, and count as the default statistic for the text field. All right, you may want to use different functions for numerical fields, such as calculating an average. Okay, So in addition to changing the summary statistic, you might want to change the column label that appears above the summary statistic, or you might need to format the aggregated values. All right. So to modify any of these settings, you would click on the appropriate field in the pivot table and then click Field Settings in the Active Field group. All right, this is on the Analyze tab to display the value field settings. Then you can type in the name you want to appear in the column box on a custom name. Now I know that's something that a lot of students get hung up on when it asks for custom field names. All right. So again, you click on the value in the appropriate field in the pivot table and click on the field settings in the active field group. And then on the Analyze tab, it'll display the value field settings dialog box. And here's where you can change the name. All right. You can also select the summary statistical function you would want to use to summarize the values. All right. So here is the value field settings box. Here's where I can create a custom name. Here's where I can select different functions. And here's where I can change number formats. Now again, all those settings are under the value field settings, and you get to that by right-clicking on the appropriate field. All right, so now filtering and slicing a pivot table. All right, setting filters, inserting a timeline, inserting a slicer, customizing the slicer. All right, so you can create filters on a pivot table by selecting pivot table fields and dragging it down to the filters group. Okay? Or the filters area. Let's see if there's anything more I want to say about that. And then you'll get the little filter option, as you should be used to seeing by now. And then you can deselect or select what you want filtered out. All right, a slicer is a small window containing one button for each unique item in a field, so you can filter a pivot table quickly. All right. Slicers are handy for people who may have a problem getting around a pivot table in Excel. So you can create little handy dandy slicers so they can easily manipulate and see the data that they need to see. Okay, so insert a slicer. You go on the Analyze tab and the Filter group, and then you click Insert Slicer. All right, you see the Analyze tab again when you select inside of a pivot table. All right, then the Analyze tab will show, and then you can click on Select Slicer. All right, and then you click on one or more field checkboxes to display one or more slicers, and then you click OK. So this will come up, and then you'll say, I want to show a slicer for area, book type, whatever. And then this is what a slicer looks like. Basically, it looks like a button. Once a slicer has been inserted into the worksheet, you can manipulate a slicer by doing one of the following. You can filter data by one value. You can click on the slicer button to filter by the value represented by the button. You can filter data by multiple values. You can click on the multi-select tool, and you can click on multi-select to be able to click more than one button to filter data for multiple values, or you can clear filter. You can click clear filter in the top right corner of the slicer to clear the filters for that field. All right, so in this example, family, introductory, and social problems have been selected and the discipline slicer. So this person just said, I just want to see stuff about family, introductory, and social problems. I don't want to see all the rest of these things. When you select a slicer, the Slicer Tools option tab displays so you can customize the slicer. All right. So basically, you can change the width. All right. You can change the height. You can change the slicer styles. You can arrange the slicer's placement in relation to each other in groups. Here you can see you can change the colors. All right, you can also create what's called a pivot timeline. Here's an example of a pivot timeline. A pivot table timeline filters data based on a data range selected. A pivot table timeline is a small window that starts on the first date and ends with the last date in a data source. And it contains horizontal tiles that can be clicked to filter data by day, month, quarter, or year. All right, to insert a timeline and filter data on a timeline in a pivot table, again, you go to the Analyze tab in the Filter group, and then click Insert Timeline to open the Insert open up the Insert Timelines dialog box. Then you click on a field, and then you click OK, and then Excel will display the timeline in the worksheet, and the Timeline Tools option tab displays, as you can see here. Okay. Then you can click on the arrow by the current time level to select a time period. So you can, you can select years, quarters, months, or days, and then you can also click on a tile on a timeline to filter the data. All right, now moving on to creating a calculated field, showing values as calculations. All right, a calculated field is a user-defined field that derives its values based on performing calculations in other fields in the pivot table. All right, so to create a calculated field, you would select a cell within the pivot table. And on the Analyze tab in the Calculations group, click on Fields, Items, and Sets. I think there's a showed. I think we'll see that in another screen, Field Items and Sets. And then you select the calculated field to display the Insert Calculated Field dialog box. Then here you can type a descriptive label for the name of the calculated field. And then you can build a formula starting with the equal sign. So you got to type equals, and then you can build your formula. You build your formula using field names. Okay, so instead of using cell references, when you're creating calculated fields, you insert the field name and other operands. For example, equals total book sales multiplied by 0.1, and that will calculate 10%. Okay, or a 10% royalty amount on total book sales. All right, so again, for a calculated field, you don't use cell references, you use field names. Okay? The cell reference is like C2 plus A2. A field reference is like, again, total books multiplied by 0.1, or any of these fields. All right, in addition to creating a calculated field, you can apply built-in custom calculations that display relationships between values and rows in a pivot table. All right, to do that, you click the field in the values area right here of the pivot table fields list. and then you select value field settings. All right, then then you'll click on show values as tab within the value field settings dialog box, and then click on it to show values as arrow and select the desired calculation type. All right. So this example here shows the discipline and area fields are contained in a row area, and the total sales field is inserted 3 times in the values area. Okay. So it sums the totals of each discipline and area, and it shows the percent of the parent row and the percent of the grand total. Okay. You can also change the style of a pivot table. Here's a pivot table tools design tab, and it has a bunch of galleries here. All right. You can create relationships, and you can create a pivot table from related tables. All right, so a data model. A data model is a collection of related tables that contain structured data used to create a database. Okay, after we're done with Excel, we're going to move on to Access. All right. This is like the start of the concept of Access here. Okay. So you can basically create relationships in Excel as well. You can create a relationship between 2 or more Excel tables that have something in common in a relationship. This is similar to creating relationship among common tables in an Access database. All right, a relationship, when we're talking about a relationship in terms of a database, a relationship is an association or connection between 2 tables where both tables contain a common data field. All right, so to create a relationship between 2 tables in Excel, you click on the Data tab. Okay, and then you click Relationships in the Data Tools, as you can see right here. And then that'll open a Manage Relationships dialog box. All right, and here you select the primary table. Okay. And then you can and then you select a related table. You also can choose your related columns. After a relationship has been created between tables, a pivot table can be created from both tables. The fields from both tables are available from which to choose, giving you more detailed analysis of the data. To create a pivot table from a data model, you click within the primary table, then you click on the Insert tab and click Pivot Table in the Tables group, and then you open the Create Pivot Table dialog box. You have to make sure the primary table name is displayed in the table range box right here. And then you click Add this data to the data model checkbox as well, right here. Then you click OK. All right, so this slide here shows a pivot table created from 2 related tables, sales and reps, using fields from each. So we see now in a pivot table fields pane, we have both of the tables listed, and now you can select. We have both tables listed, and you can select fields from each table. All right, you get this if you have, again, relationships created. Okay. You can also create a pivot chart from pivot tables. A pivot chart is an interactive graphic of data and a pivot table that visually presents the consolidated data. So to create a pivot chart, you have to click inside the pivot table, and then you'll see the Analyze tab and a Tools group. And then you click on Pivot Chart. The pivot chart contains elements for you to enable to set filters. So you can filter on a pivot chart. The rows area is replaced with the axis category. The columns area is replaced with the legend series. The field used for the filters area remains a field to use to filter data within the pivot chart. And the fields used for values in the pivot table remains a field that builds a plot area within the pivot chart. All right, so you see right here is where you have once you have a pivot chart inserted, this changed to pivot chart fields. And below here you see you have legend and you have axis now. So that's really important to note. So in summary, a subtotal function. The subtotal function gives you the ability to use sum, average, count, and max and min. I think that means that count A is supposed to be here. Pivot table consolidates and summarizes data. It enables data analysis in a data set. Again, a data set is a big piece of data, big spreadsheet, etc. It rearranges data for analysis from different viewpoints. A pivot chart is an interactive graph of pivot table data. Does anyone have any questions? All right. The student who said they needed to leave early, that was you, right? You can go if you need to roll out. I'm going to show these audio PowerPoints. Sorry, the lecture went longer than I expected. But like I said, you can't rush this pivot table topic, so. You have a good weekend. Everyone, in my IT lab, you should be seeing your study guide, okay? Not only should you listen to the lectures and all that, but you should be doing the readings if you really want to have a great understanding of the material. And that's why I give these study guides out to you.
In Chapter 5, you will expand your knowledge of Excel by learning how to analyze data using subtotals, pivot tables, and PivotCharts. The objectives for this chapter are subtotal data, group and ungroup data, create a pivot table, modify a pivot table, filter and slice a pivot table. The objectives continue on the next slide. The objectives for this chapter are create a calculated field, change the pivot table design, create a data model, create a pivot chart. In this section, the skills include sort multiple fields, subtotal data, add a second subtotal, collapse and expand the subtotals. Excel's subtotal command inserts a subtotal row, which is a row that includes one or more aggregate functions, such as a sum or average of values within each category within a dataset. When adding subtotals to a dataset, the dataset must be a range, not a table. You must also sort the data into groups. To add subtotals to a dataset, click Subtotal in the Outline group on the Data tab to open the Subtotal dialog box. As shown in the dialog box, you specify the sorted column, select the function, and select the columns in which the subtotals are added. The results of these selections are shown on the next slide. Note the two indicated social problem sums, 97,852 and 1,031, which will be referred to on the next slide. A second level of subtotals can be added to a dataset. Adding a second level maintains the primary subtotals and adds another level of subtotals for subcategories. For example, in the social problems category, the individual areas, alcohol, drugs, conflict approach, general, and violence abuse could each be subtotaled. The subtotal command creates a hierarchical structure of data that can be grouped into related data to summarize. When a dataset has been grouped into an outline, you can collapse the outline data to show only main rows, such as subtotals, or expand the outline data to show all the details. This slide shows the dataset from the previous slide collapsed. Once again, note the two indicated social problem sums, 97,852 and 1,031, in the collapsed view. In this section, the skills include Group Data, Ungroup Data. To create an outline by columns, click the Data tab, click the Group arrow in the Outline group, and select Auto Online. For more control in creating an outline, you can create a group, which joins rows or columns of related data together into a single entity so that the group can be collapsed or expanded for data analysis. To remove a group, select the grouped column or row and click Ungroup in the Outline group. In this section, the skills include Create a recommended pivot table, create a blank pivot table, rename a pivot table. Data mining is the process of analyzing large volumes of data, using advanced statistical techniques, and identifying trends and patterns in the data. A pivot table is an interactive table that uses calculations to consolidate and summarize data from a data source into a separate table, enables you to analyze data in a dataset without altering the dataset itself, can easily and quickly be pivoted or rearranged to analyze data from different viewpoints. A pivot table can be created from the Quick Analysis Gallery or from the Recommended Pivot Tables command in the Tables group on the Insert tab. In both methods, pointing to a thumbnail displays a pivot table sample. To create a pivot table using Quick Analysis, right-click within a dataset and select Quick Analysis on the shortcut menu. Click Tables in the Quick Analysis Gallery. Click a pivot table thumbnail to create the desired pivot table. Note, pointing to a pivot table thumbnail displays a sample of the table. To create a pivot table from the Recommended Pivot Tables dialog box, click inside the dataset. Click the Insert tab and click Recommended Pivot Tables in the Tables group to open the Recommended Pivot Tables dialog box. Once the dialog box is displayed, point to a thumbnail in the gallery on the left side of the dialog box to display a preview of the pivot table on the right side. Click a thumbnail to select it and click OK. Excel creates a pivot table on a new worksheet. On the new sheet, a pivot table and the Pivot Table Fields List task pane are displayed. The pane displays the list of fields in a dataset and areas to place the fields to create the layout. These areas are used to organize data in columns, rows, values, and filters. As seen in the lower right side of the slide, there are 4 areas. Filters displays top-level filters above the pivot table so that you can set filters to display results based on particular conditions you set. Columns displays columns of summarized data for the selected fields. Rows groups the data into categories in the first column based on the selected fields. Values displays summary statistics such as totals or averages for the selected field. To create a blank pivot table, on the Insert tab in the Tables group tab, click Pivot Table to open the Create Pivot Table dialog box. Select the data that you want to analyze, table or range within the open workbook, or a connection to an external dataset. Select where you want to place the pivot table, New Worksheet or Existing Worksheet, and click OK. In this section, the skills include add rows to a pivot table, add columns to a pivot table, remove fields from a pivot table, rearrange fields in a pivot table, change value field settings, refresh a pivot table. To add a field as a row, you would do one of these steps. Click the Fields checkbox to select it in the Choose Fields to Add to Report section. Drag the field from the Choose Fields to Add to Report section and drop it in the Rows area. Right-click the field name in the Choose Fields to Add to Report section and select Add to Row Labels. The sequence of the fields within the Rows area dictates the hierarchy. In this example, we want to show the areas within each discipline for the textbook list. To show this hierarchy, list the discipline field first and area field second in the Rows area. As we saw with rows, to add values to the pivot table, you would do one of the following steps. Click the Fields checkbox to select it in the Choose Fields to Add to Report section. Drag the field from the Choose Fields to Add to Report section and drop it in the Values area. Right-click the field name in the Choose Fields to Add to Report section and select Add to Values. In this example, we are counting the number of books by titles, 9 Aging Death, finding the number of books sold, 179,415 in the introductory discipline, and the sales, $21,273,970 for research stats. To subdivide data into columns, drag a field from the Choose Fields to Add to Report section and drop it in the Columns area. This slide shows a pivot table that uses the discipline field as rows, the sum of units sold wholesale field as values, and copyright field as columns. Each discipline label and each copyright year label appears only once in the pivot table. As you continue adding and arranging fields, the pivot table may contain too much data to be useful, making it necessary to remove fields. You can remove fields to reduce the amount of data to analyze. To remove a field from the pivot table, you would do one of the following steps. Click the field name in the Drag Fields Between Areas Below section and select Remove Field. Click the checkbox next to the field name to deselect it in the Choose Fields to Add to Report section. Drag a field name in the Drag Fields Between Areas Below section outside the pivot table fields list. To move a field from one pivot table area to another, you would do one of the following steps. Drag the field in the Drag Fields Between Areas Below section. Click the field arrow within the area and select Move to Report Filter, Move to Row Labels, Move to Column Labels, or Move to Values. In this example, to remove the unit sold wholesale, deselect its checkbox. To move area from rows to columns, drag it from one section to the other. Excel uses the sum function as the default summary statistic for numerical fields and count as the default statistic for text field. You might want to use a different function for numerical fields, such as calculating an average. In addition to changing the summary statistic, you might want to change the column label that appears above the summary statistic, or you might need to format the aggregated values. To modify any of these settings, you would click a value in the appropriate field in the pivot table and click Field Settings in the Active Field group on the Analyze tab to display the Value Field Settings dialog box. Type the name you want to appear as the column label in the Custom Name box. Select the Summary Statistical function you want to use to summarize the values in the Summarize Value field by list. Click Number Format to open an abbreviated version of the Format Cells dialog box. Select a number type and click OK twice. Pivot tables are not automatically updated if you make any changes to the underlying data in the data source. To update the pivot table, you click in the pivot table. Click the Analyze tab. Click Refresh in the data group to refresh the current pivot table only, or click the refresh arrow and select Refresh All to refresh all pivot tables in the workbook. In this section, the skills include Set Filters, Insert a Timeline, Insert a Slicer, Customize a Slicer. Pivot tables display aggregated data for each category. However, you may want to apply filters to show only a subset of the pivot table. You can specify a particular field to filter the pivot table. To set a pivot table filter, drag a field to the Filters area in the Pivot Table Fields list. Click the filter arrow in cell B1 to open the filter menu and complete one of the following steps. Select the value in the list to filter the data by that value only. Click the Select Multiple Items checkbox if you want to select more than one value to filter the pivot table. Click the checkboxes by each value you want to set. Type a value in the search box if the list is long and you want to find a value quickly. Click OK. In this example, we are displaying values filtered for the 1, 2, 5, 7, 9 editions. A slicer is a small window containing one button for each unique item in a field so that you can filter the pivot table quickly. To insert a slicer, on the Analyze tab in the Filter group, click Insert Slicer to open the Insert Slicers dialog box. Click one or more field checkboxes to display one or more slicers, and click OK. Once a slicer has been inserted into the worksheet, you can manipulate a slicer by doing one of the following. Filter data by one value. Click the Slicer button to filter by the value represented by the button. Filter data by multiple values. Click Multi-Select to be able to click more than one button to filter data for multiple values. Clear a filter. Click Clear Filter in the top right corner of the slicer to clear the filters for that field. In this example, Family, Introductory, and Social problems have been selected in the Disciplines slicer. When you select a slicer, the Slicer Tools Options tab displays so that you can customize a slicer. The following list describes the commands on the Slicer Tools Options tab. Slicer enables you to change the slicer caption. Slicer Styles applies a style to the slicer by specifying the color of the filtered item in the slicer. Arrange specifies the slicer's placement in relation to other groups. Buttons defines how many columns are displayed in the selected slicer and the height and width of each button inside the slicer. Size sets the height and width of the slicer window. In this example for the two slicers, the active filters in the Addition slicer appear in blue and unavailable items appear in light blue. There are 2 columns in the Addition slicer and 1 in the Discipline slicer. The Discipline slicer's height is 3.13 inches. A pivot table timeline filters data based on the date range selected. A pivot table timeline is a small window that starts with the first date and ends with the last date in the data source, and it contains horizontal tiles that can be clicked to filter data by day, month, quarter, or year. To insert a timeline and filter data on a timeline in a pivot table, on the Analyze tab in the Filter group, click Insert Timeline to open the Insert Timeline dialog box. Click a field checkbox and click OK. Excel displays a timeline in the worksheet, and the Timeline Tools Options tab displays. Click the arrow by the current time level and select a time period, years, quarters, months, or days. Click a tile on the timeline to filter data. In this example, the tile level is months for the year 2018, January through December. Note the horizontal scroll bar at the bottom of the timeline window, which is necessary to view January through April. In this section, the skills include create a calculated field, show values as calculations. A calculated field is a user-defined field that derives its value based on performing calculations in other fields in a pivot table. To create a calculated field, you select a cell within the pivot table. On the Analyze tab in the Calculations group, click Fields, Items, and Sets, and select Calculated Field to display the Insert Calculated Field dialog box. Type a descriptive label for the calculated field in the name box. Build a formula starting with the equal sign and click OK. Note, instead of using cell references, you insert the field names and other operands. For example, equal sign, apostrophe, total book sales, apostrophe, asterisk, .1 will calculate a 10% royalty amount on the total book sales. In addition to creating calculated fields, you can apply built-in custom calculations that display relationships between values in rows and columns in the pivot table. To display values in relation to others, you click the fields in the Values area of the PivotTable fields list and select Value Field Settings. Click the Show Values As tab within the Value Field Settings dialog box. Click the Show Values As arrow and select the desired calculation type. Click Number Format to set number formats and click OK 2 times. This example shows the discipline and area fields are contained in the Rows area, and the total sales field is inserted 3 times in the Values area. Sum of the totals for each discipline and area, percentage of parent row total, percentage of grand total. In this section, the skills include change the pivot table style. A pivot table style controls bold formatting, font colors, shading colors, and border. To change the style, you click the Pivot Table Tools Design tab. Click More in the Pivot Table Styles group to display the pivot table styles. Point to a thumbnail on the gallery and click a style to apply it to the pivot table. In this section, the skills include create relationships, create a pivot table from related tables. A data model is a collection of related tables that contain structured data used to create a database. You can create a relationship between 2 or more Excel tables that have some commonality and relationship. This is similar to creating relationships among common tables in an Access database. A relationship is an association or connection between 2 tables where both tables contain a common data field. To create a relationship between 2 tables in Excel, you click the Data tab and click Relationships in the Data Tools group to open the Manage Relationships dialog box. Click New in the dialog box to open the Create Relationship dialog. Click the Table arrow and select the name of the primary table. Click the Column, Foreign arrow, and select the name of the column that contains a relationship to the related or lookup table. Click the Related Table arrow and select the name of the related or lookup table. Click the Related column, Primary arrow, and select the name of the column that is related to the primary table. Click OK and click Close. In this example, the primary table is Sales. The rep ID is the column that relates to a column in the other table. The related table is Reps, and the ID column in the Reps table relates to the Rep ID column in the Sales table. After a relationship has been created between tables, a pivot table can be created from both tables. The fields from both tables are available from which to choose, giving more detailed analysis of the data. To create a pivot table from the data model, you click within the primary table. Click the Insert tab and click Pivot Table in the Tables group to open the Create Pivot Table dialog box. Make sure the primary table name is displayed in the Table Range box. Click the Add this data to the Data Model checkbox and click OK. This slide shows the pivot table created from the 2 related tables, Sales and Reps, using fields from each. In this section, the skills include create a pivot chart, modify the pivot chart. A pivot chart is an interactive graphical representation of the data in a pivot table and visually presents the consolidated data. To create a pivot chart, you click inside the pivot table. On the Analyze tab in the Tools group, click Pivot Chart. The pivot chart contains elements that enable you to set filters. The Rows area is replaced with Axis, Category. The Columns area is replaced with Legend, Series. The field used for the Filters area remains a field to use to filter data within the pivot chart. The field used for values in a pivot table remains a field that builds the plot area within the pivot chart. Excel creates the pivot chart based on the current pivot table settings, but you can change the settings using the pivot chart fields list. Click the Filters arrow and select Values to filter the chart. Click the Axis Category arrows to sort or filter the categories and subcategories in rows. Click the Legend Series to filter the chart based on the values. Note, any changes you make to the pivot chart also affect the corresponding pivot table. The subtotal function can be used to analyze large data sets. Its name is a little misleading. In addition to calculating sums, you can find averages, perform counts, and determine the maximum or minimum. A pivot table is an interactive table that uses calculations to consolidate and summarize data from a data source into a separate table. Enables you to analyze data in a dataset without altering the dataset itself. Can easily and quickly be pivoted or rearranged to analyze data from different viewpoints. A pivot chart is an interactive graphical representation of the data in a pivot table and visually presents the consolidated data. It is important to understand how to analyze data and large data sets using these additional Excel tools, subtotals, pivot tables, and pivot charts. Are there any questions?
Anyone have any questions? All right. Have a good night, folks. And happy Halloween.